By late 1944, an entire German army was trapped on the Baltic coast with no path to victory, no clear escape, and no strategic purpose left. Yet it continued to fight for 6 more months, as if the war could still be changed. What kept the Courland pocket alive, long after Germany itself was already falling apart? By the summer of 1944, the strategic balance on the Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly. The Soviet Union, after absorbing and reversing Germany's initial invasion, had launched a sequence of large-scale offensives that steadily pushed the Wehrmacht westward. Operation Bagration, which began in June 1944, destroyed much of Germany's Army Group Center and opened the road toward the Baltic region. As Soviet forces advanced through Belarus and into the Baltic states, the German Army Group North found itself increasingly isolated from the main body of German forces. The region known as Courland in western Latvia began to take on unexpected strategic significance as a result of this rapid collapse. Courland was not, at first, intended to become a major battlefield. Its importance lay primarily in geography and logistics. The area contained several ice-free ports on the Baltic Sea, including Liepaja and Ventspils, which allowed Germany to maintain maritime supply routes with the Reich. These ports were also seen as potential bases for naval operations against Soviet shipping in the Baltic. When Soviet forces reached the coast near Memel in October 1944, they cut off Army Group North from East Prussia, encircling approximately 200,000 to 220,000 German troops in the Courland Peninsula. What followed was not an improvised retreat or a brief encirclement battle, but a prolonged and static campaign that lasted until the final days of the war. From the German leadership's perspective, the situation in Courland reflected a broader crisis of priorities and decision-making. By late 1944, Germany faced simultaneous pressure on multiple fronts: the Soviet advance in the east, the Allied invasion in Normandy, and the subsequent breakout into France, and intensifying air attacks on German industry and cities. Resources were insufficient to stabilize all fronts simultaneously. Within this context, the decision not to evacuate Army Group North from Courland became contentious even within German command circles. Senior officers, including Heinz Guderian, argued that the troops should be withdrawn to reinforce the defense of East Prussia and the approaches to Berlin. Adolf Hitler rejected these proposals and insisted that Courland be held, viewing the pocket as both a shield for Baltic naval operations and a symbol of continued resistance. On the Soviet side, the formation of the Courland pocket was initially not a central objective, but rather a byproduct of broader operational goals. The Red Army's primary focus in late 1944 was the destruction of remaining German forces in Poland, East Prussia, and Hungary. The Baltic region was important for political and military reasons, but Soviet planners recognized that German forces trapped in Courland were increasingly irrelevant to the outcome of the war, as long as they remained contained. As a result, while repeated offensives were launched against the pocket, Courland never received the same concentration of forces as the main axes of advance toward the German heartland. The population of Latvia, which had experienced successive Soviet and German occupations since 1940, was caught between these shifting military priorities. By the time the Courland pocket formed, much of the civilian population had fled westward with retreating German units, fearing the return of Soviet rule. Those who remained faced mobilization, requisitions, and displacement as both sides consolidated their positions. Railways, ports, and agricultural lands became military infrastructure, reshaping daily life under conditions of prolonged uncertainty. Militarily, Army Group North entered the Courland pocket with a significant but uneven composition of forces. It consisted of approximately 26 divisions, including infantry, security formations, and remnants of armored units. Equipment levels varied widely. While some divisions still retained cohesive structure and artillery support, others were under strength and reliant on improvised defenses. The Luftwaffe maintained limited air cover through nearby airfields and supply flights, but fuel shortages and Allied air superiority restricted sustained operations. The Kriegsmarine continued to operate evacuation and resupply routes across the Baltic, but shipping losses increased as the war progressed. For the German government, holding Courland also carried political implications. The Baltic states had been incorporated into the Soviet Union before the war, occupied by Germany in 1941, and were now again under Soviet advance. The continued presence of German forces in Courland allowed Berlin to delay the full Soviet consolidation of Latvia. This had little practical impact on the unfolding military disaster elsewhere, but it shaped the way Courland was perceived within German propaganda as a bastion that continued to resist, even as other fronts collapsed. By November 1944, it had become clear that the German forces in Courland were strategically isolated. Supplies could still arrive by sea, but only in limited quantities. Reinforcements were no longer realistic, and large-scale offensive operations were beyond German capability. Yet the pocket remained intact, and Soviet efforts to destroy it were repeatedly postponed in favor of more decisive operations farther south. The stage was set for a prolonged confrontation in which tens of thousands of soldiers would continue to fight, not for territorial gain or strategic breakthrough, but to hold a shrinking perimeter in a war whose outcome was already determined elsewhere. By late November 1944, the Courland front had stabilized into a wide defensive arc, stretching roughly 150 kilometers from the Baltic coast near Ventspils, through the forests and marshlands east of Liepaja, and down toward the Daugava River basin. German field positions were now organized into a layered system designed to slow, absorb, and counter repeated Soviet assaults. Trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and interlocking artillery zones defined the front. The German command expected that the Soviets would renew large-scale attacks once winter conditions hardened the ground and improved mobility. The strategic objectives of both sides had diverged sharply by this stage. For the German High Command, Courland had ceased to be a potential maneuver battlefield and had become a static holding area whose main purpose was to tie down Soviet forces. Hitler continued to reject all proposals for evacuation, arguing that the presence of German troops in Courland forced the Red Army to divert forces from the main drives into East Prussia and Poland. German naval staff also insisted that retaining the Baltic ports allowed continued submarine training and naval operations in the Baltic Sea. These arguments, while increasingly detached from the broader operational situation, shaped German decision-making throughout the winter. Soviet objectives were more flexible. The Red Army Command viewed Courland as a secondary front whose containment was sufficient as long as its forces remained isolated. However, political considerations also played a role. Latvia was formally incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940, and the full restoration of Soviet territorial control carried symbolic and administrative importance. For this reason, the Baltic fronts continued planning periodic major offensives aimed at destroying the pocket when resources allowed. The second large Soviet offensive against the Courland pocket began in December 1944. Elements of the Second Baltic Front and the Leningrad Front shifted artillery units, armored brigades, and assault infantry into forward positions. The offensive opened with concentrated artillery preparation, followed by infantry advances directed at several sectors simultaneously. Soviet forces sought to exploit weak points near Saldus and Dobele, attempting to split the German defensive line and drive toward the coast. Despite achieving initial penetrations of several kilometers in some areas, Soviet units met stiff resistance as German reserves were rapidly shifted into threatened sectors. German defensive tactics during this phase emphasized elastic defense. Forward positions were often lightly held, with stronger forces stationed several kilometers behind the front line. When Soviet infantry advanced after artillery barrages, German units conducted localized withdrawals, counterattacking with concentrated fire and limited armored support once Soviet momentum slowed. This approach reduced German casualties while forcing Soviet units to fight repeated short-range battles in difficult terrain. Air operations over Courland reflected the broader imbalance in the air war by late 1944. Soviet air forces maintained numerical superiority and conducted frequent ground attack missions against German supply routes, artillery positions, and port facilities. German fighter cover was limited by fuel shortages and the declining number of operational aircraft. Nevertheless, anti-aircraft units remained active, and some transport convoys continued to reach Courland under escort, particularly during periods of low visibility. Civilian conditions deteriorated further as the winter deepened. Many towns near the front lines were repeatedly evacuated and reoccupied as fighting fluctuated. Agricultural production had collapsed due to labor shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and ongoing requisitions. Food scarcity became widespread among civilians, leading to increased reliance on informal barter networks and small-scale subsistence farming wherever possible. Medical facilities operated under constant strain, serving both wounded soldiers and civilians injured during bombardments. By January 1945, the front remained largely unchanged in territorial terms. Soviet forces had gained localized ground in several sectors, but had failed to dismember the German defensive system. German casualties, while significant, were offset to some degree by the continued arrival of replacements by sea. At the same time, news filtering into Courland from the outside world made the larger strategic picture increasingly clear. The Red Army had entered East Prussia, Budapest was encircled, and Allied forces were advancing toward the Rhine. Inside the pocket, military operations continued with disciplined regularity, but the recognition that the wider war was entering its final phase was becoming impossible to ignore among officers and enlisted men alike. By early 1945, the strategic goals and operational planning on both sides of the Courland front had become increasingly shaped by the approaching endgame of the war. For the German High Command, the Courland Group no longer represented a force capable of influencing the overall outcome of the conflict. Instead, its continued existence had become a problem of resources, transport capacity, and political stubbornness. Hitler's refusal to authorize a large-scale evacuation defined all subsequent German planning in the region. While senior officers repeatedly proposed withdrawal to reinforce East Prussia and the approaches to Berlin, these proposals were systematically rejected. As a result, German operational planning in Courland focused almost entirely on maintaining defensive cohesion and sustaining the minimum level of supply required to keep the pocket operational. Logistics became the central challenge. All supplies had to arrive by sea through the ports of Liepaja and Ventspils. Between October 1944 and April 1945, the Kriegsmarine transported hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo into the pocket, including ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies. At the same time, wounded personnel and selected civilian evacuees were transported out. However, shipping losses increased steadily due to Soviet submarine activity, air attacks, and mining operations in the Baltic Sea. Ice conditions during the harsh winter further restricted navigation and caused bottlenecks in port operations. The German logistical system could sustain static defense but was incapable of supporting large-scale offensive maneuvers. German force structure inside the pocket also shaped planning limitations. The Courland Group consisted primarily of the 16th and 18th Armies, totaling roughly 26 divisions. Infantry divisions formed the backbone of the defense, while armored units were present only in fragmented form, often reduced to small battle groups operating with limited fuel and spare parts. Artillery remained the most reliable German firepower asset, but ammunition rationing became increasingly strict as the months passed. Air support, once a decisive factor on the Eastern Front, was now marginal in both scale and effect. On the Soviet side, strategic planning treated Courland as a secondary operational theater. The main objectives of the Red Army during the winter of 1944 to 1945 were the capture of East Prussia, the destruction of German forces in Hungary and Austria, and the final advance toward Berlin. Courland, while politically significant, did not directly obstruct these primary axes of advance. As a result, Soviet planners allocated sufficient forces to contain and periodically attack the pocket, but not enough to guarantee its rapid destruction without diverting resources from more decisive fronts. Nevertheless, Soviet operational doctrine emphasized the steady application of pressure. The Baltic Front's planned successive reduction operations aimed at gradually eroding German defensive strength, limiting supply capacity, and exhausting manpower inside the pocket. These operations relied heavily on artillery concentration, massed infantry assaults, and short-range armored breakthroughs supported by mobile artillery units. Railroad and road networks behind the Soviet lines allowed for the systematic buildup of forces for each planned offensive phase. Propaganda considerations also shaped planning on both sides. German-controlled media portrayed Courland as a fortress that symbolized endurance and continued resistance, emphasizing successful defensive actions while avoiding discussion of the broader strategic collapse. Soviet propaganda, meanwhile, emphasized the isolation of German forces in the Baltic and framed Courland as a holding pen for remnants of the retreating Wehrmacht. For both sides, controlling the narrative surrounding Courland served broader political messaging goals, even as the military reality grew increasingly detached from these portrayals. Intelligence assessments increasingly diverged between field commanders and central leadership. German officers inside the pocket generally possessed a clearer understanding of their strategic isolation than authorities in Berlin were willing to acknowledge officially. They reported shortages, declining morale, and diminishing combat power, but these assessments rarely altered high-level directives. Soviet intelligence, by contrast, monitored German strength accurately through aerial reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and reports from partisan groups operating in nearby regions. By early 1945, Soviet planners understood that the Courland group could neither escape nor conduct a meaningful breakout without massive reinforcements that Germany no longer possessed. By February 1945, operational planning on both sides had reached a state of rigid predictability. German plans centered on preserving the defensive perimeter and preventing sudden sector collapses. Soviet plans concentrated on selecting specific sectors for periodic large-scale assaults while maintaining sufficient surrounding forces to block any potential German breakout. The front in Courland had become strategically static, but beneath this apparent immobility, the erosion of German combat capability was continuing at a steady pace. The renewed phase of large-scale combat operations against the Courland pocket began in late January 1945, marking the transition from strategic planning to sustained high-intensity engagements along multiple sectors of the front. Soviet forces launched what would later be designated as the Third Major Offensive against the pocket. The primary objective was to split the German defensive arc in two by driving toward the coast near Liepaja, and thereby isolating individual army groupings inside the perimeter. The attacking Soviet formations included elements of the First Baltic Front, supported by heavy artillery groupings, assault engineer units, and armored brigades equipped with T-34 tanks and Su-76 self-propelled guns. The opening phase of the offensive began with a concentrated artillery preparation that lasted several hours across selected breakthrough sectors. Soviet artillery units deployed hundreds of guns and rocket launchers, targeting German trench systems, communication nodes, and previously identified artillery emplacements. This preparatory fire disrupted forward German positions, but failed to annihilate the deeper defensive layers. German units had refined their defensive doctrine over months of continuous pressure, maintaining reserves behind the front, and preparing fallback positions to absorb initial assaults. Following the barrage, Soviet infantry advanced in dense formations, supported by close-range armor and combat engineers equipped to clear minefields and obstacle belts. In several sectors near Saldus and Preakul, Soviet units achieved limited breakthroughs of 2 to 4 kilometers. These advances forced German formations to conduct controlled withdrawals to secondary defensive lines. However, attempts to widen the penetrations met resistance as German artillery shifted fire concentrations and reserve infantry battalions were redeployed to stabilize the front. Local counterattacks succeeded in containing the most dangerous Soviet thrusts. The terrain played a decisive role in shaping the character of these first engagements. Dense forests restricted visibility and limited the operational use of armor. Marshy ground slowed infantry movement and made the evacuation of wounded difficult. Road networks were narrow and frequently destroyed by artillery fire, creating logistical bottlenecks on both sides. These conditions favored defensive operations and contributed to the slow, grinding nature of the fighting. Civilians remaining in the contested zones faced repeated displacement as villages changed hands during short-lived Soviet advances and subsequent German counter-movements. Many settlements were systematically evacuated by German authorities for military reasons, while others were abandoned spontaneously as fighting approached. Buildings were frequently reused as both defensive strongpoints and temporary medical facilities. The civilian population endured shelling, forced labor assignments, and shortages of food and heating materials amid winter conditions. At sea, Soviet air and naval forces intensified efforts to disrupt German supply routes. Bombers targeted port facilities at Liepaja and Ventspils, damaging warehouses, piers, and transport ships. The Soviet Baltic Fleet deployed submarines to intercept German convoys supplying the pocket. Between January and March 1945, several German transport vessels were sunk or damaged, reducing the volume of supplies reaching the encircled forces. Nonetheless, enough shipping capacity remained operational to sustain minimum defensive requirements. By mid-February, the Soviet offensive lost momentum. German defensive restructuring succeeded in sealing off the most dangerous penetrations, and Soviet assault formations began to suffer mounting casualties without obtaining decisive operational results. While limited territorial gains had been achieved, the German line had not collapsed. Both sides recorded heavy losses in manpower and equipment during this period, although precise figures remain uncertain due to incomplete wartime documentation. These early 1945 engagements demonstrated a recurring pattern that would define much of the Courland fighting. Soviet forces retained numerical superiority and operational initiative, while German formations relied on layered defense, rapid redeployment of reserves, and terrain exploitation to prevent breakthrough and encirclement within the pocket. The strategic isolation of the Courland group remained unchanged, but its defensive coherence had once again proven resilient under sustained pressure. The failure of the winter offensives to decisively break the Courland defenses did not reduce the intensity of the conflict. Instead, by March 1945, the campaign entered a phase of escalation defined by continuous local engagements, mounting casualties, and increasing strain on both command systems. Soviet forces regrouped and initiated what became the fourth and fifth major offensives against the pocket in rapid succession. These operations were no longer conceived as attempts at swift encirclement, but as systematic efforts to compress the defensive perimeter, sector by sector, through cumulative pressure. The fourth offensive opened in mid-March with coordinated attacks along the central and southern sectors of the pocket, where the terrain allowed slightly better conditions for troop movement. Soviet forces committed fresh rifle divisions, supported by heavy artillery regiments and reinforced tank detachments. Artillery concentrations were applied with increasing precision, targeting German artillery batteries, supply nodes, and reserve assembly areas. The objective was to reduce the German ability to conduct flexible defense and force a breakdown of command coordination across the front. German responses reflected the growing operational crisis. While defensive doctrine remained effective in principle, the physical limits of manpower and material were becoming evident. Infantry battalions that had entered the pocket in 1944 with 600 to 800 men were now often reduced to 250 or fewer. Replacement drafts arriving by sea consisted increasingly of hastily trained personnel drawn from shattered formations elsewhere in the Baltic region. Ammunition rationing became stricter, with artillery fire missions carefully prioritized due to reduced resupply capacity. Weather conditions fluctuated unpredictably during this phase. Late winter thaws turned roads into mud fields that immobilized vehicles, occasionally halting Soviet armor and slowing German reserve movement alike. These periods offered temporary relief to defenders, but also complicated evacuation of wounded and delivery of supplies. Medical services inside the pocket operated under constant overload. Field hospitals near the front overflowed, and evacuation by sea could no longer keep pace with casualty volumes. On the political level, tensions inside the German leadership intensified. Senior officers within the Courland group transmitted increasingly urgent reports warning that continued defense served no operational purpose and risked the total loss of all remaining forces. These assessments were largely ignored by Hitler, who continued to demand that Courland be held as long as any shipping routes remained open. This inflexible directive transformed the pocket into a static battlefield, isolated not only geographically, but also strategically from German planning elsewhere. The international context further deepened the crisis. Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, while the Red Army advanced rapidly through East Prussia and into Pomerania. News of these developments reached the pocket through fragmented radio broadcasts and transported personnel. Awareness that Germany's external defense systems were collapsing added to the psychological burden on soldiers inside Courland, even as routine combat operations continued without interruption. Soviet forces, although heavily engaged on multiple fronts, continued to apply steady pressure against the pocket. The Fifth Offensive, launched in late March, focused on the northern sector near Tukums, with the aim of shortening the German front and pushing forces closer to the coast. Several villages were captured after prolonged bombardment, and German units were forced into further withdrawals. While no decisive rupture occurred, the defensive perimeter contracted by several kilometers in multiple areas, reducing operational depth and increasing crowding of forces. Civilians remaining in the war zone were increasingly concentrated in coastal towns under German control. Food supplies were now primarily distributed through military channels, and civilian survival depended heavily on access to German logistics. Evacuation opportunities became rare and increasingly restricted to wounded and technical specialists. The collapse of local administration left many communities in a state of semi-military governance. By early April 1945, the Courland pocket had entered its most acute crisis phase. German formations remained operational, but were now compressed into a limited coastal zone under constant artillery and air attack. The possibility of breakout by land no longer existed, and evacuation by sea was dependent on a shrinking fleet operating under increasing Soviet pressure. The escalation of combat had transformed Courland into a confined battlefield, where time, resources, and strategic relevance were all running out simultaneously. The peak phase of the Courland campaign unfolded in April 1945, as Soviet forces initiated their final large-scale attempt to dismantle the remaining German defenses before the broader collapse of the Eastern Front reached its conclusion. By this stage, the Courland group was confined to a coastal strip roughly 60 to 80 kilometers wide, anchored on the ports of Liepāja and Ventspils. Approximately 180,000 to 190,000 German troops remained in the pocket, though many units were significantly under strength and short of heavy equipment. Opposing them were elements of multiple Soviet field armies with a combined strength exceeding 300,000 personnel, rotating through containment and assault duties. The most intense fighting of the Courland campaign occurred in the sectors near Preikul and Saldus, where the Soviet command sought to rupture the final German defensive corridors leading to Liepāja. Preparatory artillery fire reached its highest density of the entire siege. Soviet artillery groups massed hundreds of tube artillery pieces and rocket launchers, delivering concentrated bombardments lasting several hours before each ground assault. These barrages targeted not only frontline positions, but also rear area roads, supply depots, and medical facilities to disrupt German internal movement. German resistance during this phase relied on a combination of exhausted infantry formations and increasingly improvised armored detachments. What remained of German tank units consisted primarily of small mixed groups of Panzer IVs and assault guns, operating with limited fuel reserves. These units were employed sparingly, usually in night counterattacks or short-range defensive thrusts aimed at sealing Soviet penetrations. Artillery remained the primary means of German firepower, though ammunition stocks were now critically limited. Civilian conditions reached their most severe point during this period. Large sections of the population had already been evacuated earlier in the war, but tens of thousands remained trapped in coastal towns and rural areas close to the front. Liepāja, in particular, experienced repeated air attacks against port infrastructure, warehouses, and rail yards. Housing stock was heavily damaged, and basic utilities collapsed under sustained bombardment. Civilian casualties increased steadily, though exact figures remain unknown due to incomplete documentation and the breakdown of civil administration. At sea, the Kriegsmarine intensified evacuation efforts as long as navigable routes remained open. Between April 10th and May 1st, 1945, dozens of transport vessels crossed between Courland ports and ports in northern Germany and Denmark. In this final phase, priority for evacuation was given to severely wounded soldiers, technical specialists, and select administrative personnel. Ordinary infantry units were largely excluded from evacuation planning by this stage, reinforcing the sense that the majority of troops would remain in the pocket until the end. Soviet air operations reached maximum intensity in April. Ground attack aircraft conducted near-continuous strikes against road junctions, troop concentrations, and coastal installations. Air dominance allowed Soviet commanders to monitor German movements in daylight and interdict most large-scale redeployments. Despite this, complete interdiction proved impossible due to the forested terrain and frequent use of night movement by German units. By late April, German command cohesion inside the pocket was visibly deteriorating. Communication disruptions became frequent, staff structures were compressed, and reserves were reduced to token formations. Nevertheless, organized defense continued along the shrinking perimeter. Soviet advances achieved several localized breakthroughs, but none produced an immediate collapse of the German line. Fighting increasingly took the form of short-range engagements over individual villages, ridgelines, and road intersections, rather than large operational maneuvers. News of events outside the pocket reached Courland in fragmented form. Reports of the Soviet capture of Berlin on May 2nd and Adolf Hitler's death filtered through command channels and civilian rumor networks. These developments had immediate psychological effects. While some units continued defensive operations with unchanged discipline, others experienced rising disorganization as the realization spread that Germany's central authority had effectively ceased to function. By the final days of April 1945, the Courland battlefield had reached its maximum density of forces within its smallest territorial extent. The campaign's peak was defined not by sweeping breakthroughs, but by continuous high-intensity pressure applied within a narrowing coastal zone. German forces were now fighting not for operational objectives, but to preserve basic survival within an environment where both strategic purpose and external coordination had effectively disappeared. As the operational situation deteriorated during the final weeks of April 1945, the character of resistance inside the Courland pocket shifted from structured defensive doctrine to improvised survival-based adaptation. German formations that once operated within clearly defined regimental and divisional frameworks increasingly functioned as fragmented battle groups. Command authority remained formally intact, but practical control over scattered units was often exercised at battalion or company level. Communications were unreliable, and field commanders were frequently forced to make autonomous decisions based on immediate tactical conditions rather than coordinated operational planning. Counterattacks continued to be launched, though on a diminishing scale. These actions were no longer intended to restore lost sectors permanently, but to disrupt Soviet penetration points long enough to reorganize defensive lines a few kilometers to the rear. Small armored detachments, often composed of 2 to 5 assault guns or tanks, were combined with improvised infantry groups for short-range night operations. These counterattacks relied heavily on surprise and local knowledge of terrain, particularly within forest belts and marsh corridors, where Soviet armor movement was restricted. While some of these actions succeeded in recovering key road junctions or village strongpoints temporarily, they rarely altered the overall direction of the fighting. Resource management became a central feature of German adaptation. Ammunition distribution was tightly regulated, and artillery fire missions were limited to high-priority targets such as massed infantry formations or armored penetrations. Fuel shortages forced a transition toward foot mobility for most formations. Horses and civilian vehicles were increasingly used for transport within rear areas. Improvised workshops attempted to maintain damaged equipment using salvaged parts from destroyed vehicles and abandoned stockpiles. Medical services also adapted under extreme conditions, with field surgeons improvising procedures amid shortages of anesthetics, bandages, and antibiotics. Psychological strain intensified as isolation became unmistakable. Soldiers inside the pocket were fully aware that German forces elsewhere were retreating or surrendering in large numbers. Radio broadcasts, intercepted communications, and sporadic contact with evacuees confirmed the collapse of German defensive systems in the West and the Soviet advance into Central Europe. Against this backdrop, continuing resistance in Courland took on a different character. Discipline was maintained in most formations, but motivation increasingly derived from unit cohesion and immediate survival rather than belief in any remaining strategic purpose. Soviet forces also adapted their operations in this final stage. Instead of attempting broad multi-army assaults, Soviet commanders emphasized localized breakthroughs and continuous probing attacks. Reconnaissance units operated extensively along the German perimeter to identify weakened sectors. Artillery fire was applied in shorter, more frequent concentrations rather than prolonged barrage operations. Soviet infantry advanced in smaller task groups designed to infiltrate forested zones, sever communication lines, and isolate German strongpoints before larger formations were committed. Partisan activity in Latvia had largely subsided by this stage due to the shifting front lines and widespread destruction of infrastructure. However, isolated intelligence support networks continued to provide Soviet forces with information about German movements, supply points, and coastal activity. These reports contributed to the precision of Soviet air and artillery strikes, particularly near port facilities and evacuation routes. Civilian behavior also reflected a form of adaptation to prolonged siege conditions. With formal administrative structures largely collapsed, survival depended on informal networks based on family ties, barter systems, and limited access to military supply channels. Civilians sought shelter in cellars, coastal cliffs, and forested areas during artillery bombardments. In towns such as Liepaja, daily life was increasingly organized around periods of bombardment and transport movements rather than any traditional social or economic rhythm. Morale within German units fluctuated sharply. Some formations continued to conduct disciplined defensive operations, sustaining cohesion through rigid adherence to routine. Others experienced growing absenteeism, disorganization, and psychological exhaustion. Desertion remained rare due to the impossibility of escape by land, but breakdowns in unit control became more frequent as the final collapse approached. By the final days of April, resistance in Courland had become less a coordinated military effort than an interwoven system of improvised defense, constrained logistics, and psychological endurance. Both sides had adapted their methods to the realities of a confined battlefield, where victory was no longer defined by territorial gain, but by the ability to maintain operational function under conditions of irreversible strategic defeat. The decisive turning point of the Courland campaign arrived not through a single battlefield breakthrough, but through the collapse of the German state itself in early May 1945. While localized fighting continued along parts of the perimeter, the strategic framework that had sustained resistance inside the pocket ceased to exist almost overnight. On May 1st, fragmentary reports of Adolf Hitler's death reached senior officers in Courland. Within days, confirmation followed that a new German government under Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had assumed authority in the north. For the first time since the pocket formed, the question of formal surrender entered operational reality. At this stage, Soviet forces maintained continuous pressure along the entire front, but had largely shifted their main offensive focus toward Berlin and Central Europe. The Courland Group was now effectively isolated not only by geography, but also by political abandonment. German naval transport operations continued for a short time after Hitler's death, but by early May these movements became increasingly disorganized as central coordination collapsed. Several evacuation convoys were turned back, while others reached ports in northern Germany without clear orders for further movement. Soviet reconnaissance activity intensified markedly during this period. Small unit probes multiplied along the German perimeter, testing the responsiveness of defensive positions and identifying areas where resistance had weakened. Soviet commanders were aware that the end of the war was imminent, but treated Courland as a potentially unstable front where disorder could still generate unpredictable fighting. Artillery continued to engage German positions, though the scale of fire had diminished compared to April. Inside the German command structure, conflicting signals created confusion, Some officers interpreted the new political situation as authorization to suspend offensive operations while maintaining defensive posture. Others anticipated imminent surrender and began preparing their units for orderly disarmament to avoid unnecessary casualties. Communications between the Courland group and the emerging German authority in Flensburg were intermittent and often delayed, contributing to uncertainty at every level of command. The formal turning point occurred on May 7, 1945, when Germany signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender at Reims, to take effect at 23:01 Central European Time on May 8th. Notification reached Courland headquarters through both German naval channels and intercepted Soviet broadcasts. For many units, the announcement initially produced disbelief, followed by confusion regarding its practical implications. Orders for cessation of hostilities were transmitted unevenly across the fragmented defensive network. Soviet commanders also received confirmation of the surrender through Stavka channels, while instructions emphasized securing German compliance and preventing unauthorized evacuations or sabotage. Soviet forces were ordered to avoid large-scale offensives during the final hours before the truce took effect. Nevertheless, sporadic exchanges of fire continued, as isolated German formations remained unaware of the official status of the war or refused to act without direct confirmation from superior headquarters. For civilians in the coastal towns, the announcement of surrender triggered a rapid psychological shift. Many emerged cautiously from shelters, uncertain whether hostilities had truly ended. German military administration effectively collapsed within hours. Local supply systems disintegrated, and civilian populations faced immediate shortages as military stockpiles were seized or abandoned without organized distribution. By the morning of May 8th, the Courland pocket was no longer a self-contained battlefield, but a transitional space between war and occupation. The operational identity of the Courland group still existed on paper, but functionally, it had ceased to act as an independent military formation. The turning point was not marked by dramatic maneuver or mass retreat, but by the sudden disappearance of the political and strategic framework that had sustained 5 months of continuous resistance. The formal end of combat operations in the Courland pocket unfolded unevenly between 8 and 10 May 1945, as surrender procedures were implemented across a fragmented and exhausted battlefield. While the Act of Unconditional Surrender had legally taken effect on the night of May 8th, its practical enforcement depended on the ability of both German and Soviet commanders to communicate orders through disrupted command networks. In several sectors, isolated firefights continued for hours, and in rare cases for more than a day, as units either did not receive the surrender order in time or delayed compliance awaiting confirmation. On the German side, the surrender of the Courland group was carried out under the supervision of senior officers who remained in place to coordinate disarmament. Colonel General Karl Hilpert, who had assumed command of the Courland forces in late January 1945, formally ordered the cessation of hostilities and began negotiations with Soviet representatives regarding the orderly capitulation of remaining units. At the time of surrender, the Courland group still contained approximately 180,000 German soldiers, including elements of the former 16th and 18th Armies, along with auxiliary personnel and support services. Disarmament proceeded in stages. German units were instructed to assemble in designated collection areas, surrender heavy weapons, and await further orders. Artillery pieces, armored vehicles, aircraft remnants, and stockpiled ammunition were systematically handed over under Soviet supervision. In coastal zones, Luftwaffe airfields and naval installations were secured by Soviet forces to prevent further evacuation attempts or sabotage. The Kriegsmarine vessels that remained in Courland waters were seized or immobilized. For many German soldiers, the transition from combat to captivity occurred abruptly. Units that had maintained cohesion until the final days were rapidly reorganized into prisoner columns. Personal weapons were confiscated, insignia removed, and individuals registered by Soviet military authorities. The uncertainty of captivity now replaced the uncertainty of combat. While formal reprisals against surrendered troops were not systematic, conditions during the initial period of internment were harsh. food shortages, inadequate shelter, and the long marches to rear area collection camps caused significant hardship. Civilian populations experienced their own immediate crisis. With the collapse of German administration and the absence of functioning Latvian civil institutions, large sections of the population were left without organized governance. Soviet military authorities assumed control of towns and infrastructure, imposing curfews and securing transport hubs, ports, and industrial facilities. In many areas, civilians sought to recover property requisitioned during the siege, while others attempted to locate missing family members amid the chaos of surrender. The humanitarian consequences of the Courland campaign became evident within days. Hospitals were overwhelmed by wounded soldiers and civilians alike. Food distribution systems had collapsed during the final weeks of fighting, and Soviet relief efforts were initially focused on military stabilization rather than civilian welfare. Thousands of displaced civilians, including evacuated residents returning to destroyed villages, faced homelessness and acute shortages of basic necessities. The broader military withdrawal from Courland was less a movement than a dissolution. German prisoners were transported eastward into the Soviet interior in successive waves. Many were assigned to labor camps for years after the war ended. Of those taken from Courland, significant numbers would not return to Germany until the late 1940s or early 1950s. The evacuation routes that had once sustained the pocket by sea were now silent, and the Baltic ports became instruments of Soviet logistical control. From a territorial perspective, the Courland pocket ceased to exist as a military entity almost overnight. The fortified zones that had absorbed months of artillery fire were abandoned, leaving behind devastated villages, shattered road networks, and large quantities of unexploded ordnance. Agricultural land had been heavily damaged by trench systems, minefields, and vehicle movement, leaving much of western Latvia economically paralyzed. The aftermath of the Courland campaign thus unfolded in a fragmented and uneven manner. Military withdrawal did not occur through organized retreat, but through mass surrender. There was no final breakout, no large-scale evacuation of combat forces, and no territorial transfer negotiated through diplomacy. Instead, the pocket dissolved under the weight of a defeated state, transforming a prolonged battlefield into a vast zone of prisoners, displaced civilians, and contested post-war authority. The long-term historical significance of the Courland pocket extends far beyond its geographic isolation on the Baltic coast. Militarily, the campaign became one of the clearest examples of how large formations can remain tactically functional even after they have lost all strategic relevance. For nearly 7 months, over 200,000 German troops continued organized resistance in a sector that no longer influenced the central direction of the war. This prolonged defense did not alter the outcome of Germany's defeat, but it did shape the distribution of Soviet forces during the final phase of the Eastern Front. Several Soviet armies remained tied to containment operations in Latvia rather than being fully redeployed toward Berlin or the southern advances into Austria and Hungary. From the German perspective, Courland later became a symbol of institutional paralysis at the highest levels of decision-making. The refusal to evacuate the pocket, despite repeated operational warnings, demonstrated the extent to which political rigidity had overridden military logic by late 1944. After the war, German military historians and former officers frequently cited Courland as a case study in how ideological commitment and command and flexibility led to the unnecessary loss of manpower that might otherwise have been used in the defense of central Germany. However, even these retrospective assessments remain divided over whether evacuation would have produced any meaningful change in the final outcome. For the Soviet Union, the Courland campaign carried both military and political significance. Militarily, it demonstrated the Red Army's ability to isolate, contain, and methodically pressure large enemy formations over extended periods. Politically, the destruction and surrender of the Courland Group completed the Soviet reconsolidation of the Baltic states. Latvia, which had experienced annexation, occupation, and repeated mass displacement since 1940, now entered a new phase of Soviet control that would last for nearly half a century. The The physical devastation left behind in western Latvia became one of the many regional scars of the wider Eastern Front. The human cost of Courland persisted long after the guns fell silent. Tens of thousands of German soldiers entered prolonged captivity, many spending years in Soviet labor camps before eventual repatriation. For Latvian civilians, the legacy included not only wartime destruction, but also post-war political repression, population transfers, and economic restructuring under Soviet rule. Entire communities had been erased or permanently altered by the siege, with limited documentation surviving to record individual losses in full. In post-war memory, the Courland pocket occupied an ambiguous place. In West Germany, it was remembered primarily through the experiences of former prisoners and veterans who had served in an isolated and seemingly forgotten front. In the Soviet Union, Courland received relatively limited public attention compared to more decisive battles such as Stalingrad, Kursk, or Berlin. The campaign did not produce a dramatic final assault or a symbolic moment of victory, and its long static nature made it difficult to integrate into simplified narratives of rapid advance and decisive triumph. From a broader historical perspective, Courland illustrates the late war transformation of the Eastern Front from a theater of maneuver into a landscape of attritional containment. By 1945, strategic outcomes were no longer shaped by individual pockets of resistance, but by the collapse of national industrial capacity, administrative control, and political cohesion. Courland did not fall because it was stormed by a final overwhelming assault. It ended because the state that sustained it ceased to exist. Today, the physical traces of the Courland battles remain scattered across western Latvia. Bunkers, trench systems, and unexploded munitions continue to surface in forests and farmland. War cemeteries, improvised burial sites, and restored memorials mark locations where thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives far from the main axis of the war. For local populations, the memory of the pocket is embedded not only in historical records, but in the altered geography of the countryside itself. The Courland pocket ultimately stands as a reminder that wars do not always end at clear front lines or with decisive battlefield conclusions. Sometimes they persist in isolated forms long after strategic defeat has already been sealed elsewhere. In Courland, the fighting continued after the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, sustained by inertia, obligation, and command structures that could not yet adapt to collapse. Its legacy is not defined by victory or defeat alone, but by the disconnect between tactical endurance and strategic inevitability that shaped its final months.